Good morning, everybody. On behalf of the rector of ISCTE, University Institute of Lisbon, Professora Maria de Lourdes Rodrigues, and myself, as director of the School of Sociology and Public Policy of ISCTE, I would like to welcome all the participants in this forum, as well as its co-organizers, the Portuguese and German Ministers of Foreign Affairs, and the two Portuguese academic and outreach institutions, the European Academy of Berlin and ISCTE, through its Emigration Observatory and the School of Sociology and Public Policy. Allow me to express my deepest gratitude to the team of people who, at ISCTE, at the Secretariat of the school, all the services that are supporting this conference, tell them thank you very much, especially to Joana Azevedo, Cláudia Pereira, and Carlota Moura Veiga. We are very happy to host this 5th edition of the Portuguese-German Forum, this year dedicated to migration, political action, and civic engagement. And there are many reasons for this. I will just mention 2 or 3, because this should be a really short address. The topic of migration is one of the top areas of interest of researchers in this university. In this school, the School of Sociology and Public Policy, we have nearly 40 researchers working on related topics in 6 main areas, including some that will be discussed in the forum. Education, multilingualism and second generation, international migration to and from Portugal, spatial mobility and residential segregation, family, gender, health and migration, forced migration, refugees and trafficking, and the politics of international migration. ISCTE also holds a permanent research platform, the Emigration Observatory. This observatory has a cooperation protocol with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, both co-organizers of this forum, and contributes to political decision-making, particularly through the production of knowledge aimed at supporting the definition and evaluation of public emigration policies. All the data it produces is freely accessible and disseminated through its website, targeting the general public, but mainly academia, political decision makers, and the media. More broadly, ISCTE has a strong focus on public policy. We have developed public policy programs at the various levels, undergraduate, master, and PhD, where we train our students to become qualified professionals in the design, implementation, and evaluation of public policies. And for decades, we have also been engaged in collaborative research through projects involving a variety of governmental actors and civil society, aimed at preparing, monitoring, and evaluating policies. ISCTE, last but not least, has a significant track record in initiatives aimed at hosting refugee students. Following the initiative of President Sampaio, the Global Platform for Syrian Students, ISCTE has been receiving Syrian and other nationality students who are pursuing their university training here. There are also specific courses offered on refugees, human rights, and integration, in collaboration with other partners. Finally, I would like to underline what for us is really a meaningful feature of this event. Its importance in strengthening a type of partnership we are enacting today. Knowledge production and policy making each have their own rationality and fundamentals. However, knowledge production is critical for anchoring public choices by allowing accurate diagnosis of problems, identification of resources and opportunities, by promoting critical evaluation of the conditions and effects of policies, and by devising possible scenarios and alternative futures. So I hope that today's event will contribute to drawing better futures for the crucial problems Europe and the world are facing in relation to migration, and also that it will strengthen our cooperation in follow-up activities. So thank you very much for proposing this event to ISCTE. May we have enlightening and consequent exchanges. I wish you all a very successful seminar. Thank you for coming.
Dear Professor Carreras, dear Rui, dear Mr. Vitorino, dear State Secretary Bittner, dear João, ambassadors, dear participants in the forum, dear guests. I am delighted to co-welcome all of you to this ambitious Luso-German event. I am pleased to see that new life has been breathed into a venerable bilateral institution, which we call the German-Portuguese Forum, that was last convened in Berlin in autumn of 2016. We are now witnesses to the birth of a new type of forum with new academic partners on both sides, focusing at each session on one topic only, which will be debated not only by Portuguese and German experts, but by international partners as well. This newborn child, like any other healthy baby, has two happy parents, to wit, the two foreign ministries. But truth be told, it was largely the tenacity and creativity of my good friends, Rui Vinhas, Director General for European Affairs in the Portuguese Ministry for Foreign Affairs, and João Miro Gomes, the Portuguese ambassador in Berlin, that kept the idea of an updated forum afloat and accompanied it to its fifth implementation. Muito obrigado, Rui e João. One should not overstretch metaphors, but I think it's fair to describe the academic partners in the rebirth of the forum, the European Academy in Berlin and the Instituto Universitario de Lisboa, as very experienced and capable midwives in this endeavor. Thank you to both institutions for setting up a great program and convincing excellent speakers to join us. And thank you, Professor Carreras, for hosting us today. I would wish to extend my profound gratitude to Antonio Vitorino, Director General of the International Organization for Migration, for opening this conference with a keynote. It's so good to see you again, sir. Who could be better placed than you to kick off our discussion on the perspectives of migration? Heartfelt thanks go, of course, to the participants in the two panels and in the fishbowl discussion, as well as to their moderators. We are very much looking forward to your findings and the debate. Perhaps a final word from me as regards the bilateral context of today's topic, a quite timely choice, I'd say, in particular as we approach European elections. Even though the factual impact of migration on Portugal and Germany is fundamentally different, we do see eye to eye on this issue, as, by the way, on many other dossiers on the European agenda. We Germans appreciated very much from the start of the migration crisis in 2015 until today the unwavering political and practical support of our Portuguese friends. Migration is an integral part of the current positive Luso-German agenda and an important reason why Berlin is grateful to Lisbon to have joined our so-called like-minded initiative, with which we wish to increase our joint pro-European leverage in Brussels. At a time when the EU needs to be re-legitimized in the eyes of many of its citizens, we both want to strengthen the Union in areas where European action really does represent an added value. Migration certainly counts among these areas. In closing, permit me to wish this Portuguese-German forum the best of luck and fruitful exchanges.
Obrigado. Bom dia, good morning, Mr. Vitorino, ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen. Before I introduce Mr. Vitorino, I just want to make very briefly 3 points. The first, I would like to express my gratitude to all of those who worked with us to make this forum possible, and particularly I would like to thank my good friends, Ambassadors Romira Gomes and Christophe Weil, that helped us in the task of reshaping the Portuguese-German Forum. A word of thanks also to my team in Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to Diplomatic Institute, to the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the European Academy of Berlin, a very good academic partner, and a special word of thanks to the team of ISCTE, and particularly to doctors Joana Azevedo, Cláudia Pereira, and Carlota Veiga. Thank you very much. Second, about the German-Portuguese Forum. The Portuguese-German Forum was created in 2013 during the tough years of our financial assistance program to strengthen the bilateral dialogue and reciprocal knowledge between Portugal and Germany through the gathering of political decision makers and senior officials. This year, both parties agreed on the need to renew the concept of this forum and to develop a new, more pragmatic and modernized approach with stronger participation of the civil society and with topics more relevant to our public opinions. This is the first session with this new format. The third point, why migrations? Across the world, and particularly inside the European Union, governments and societies recognize that migration are, at the present, one of the most relevant challenges that we are facing. It's politically sensitive, economically challenging, socially controversial, and problematic in humanitarian terms, and demands unequivocally regional and international cooperation. It's timely that in May, this month, the month in which we celebrate Europe, Portugal and Germany, two countries that have been responding with an open and positive posture to the migration challenge, can promote today's discussion. Taking into consideration the complexity of this topic, this forum today will approach the migration in 3 different layers. In the panel 1, after the speech of Mr. Vitorino, will provide us with a global perspective. We'll move then to the European answer in the panel 2, and finally, continuing this top-bottom approach, the panel 3 will focus on the national and local integration of migrants and what still remains to be done, sharing experiences of integration in both countries. I don't want to keep you any longer, and I will give the floor to one of the most important voices on migration, António Vitorino, Director General of IOM. António Vitorino was born in 1957. Sorry to say it. In Lisbon. He has a law academic background. He was Portuguese Minister of the Presidency and of Defense in the 90s. He was European Commission for Justice and Home Affairs from 1999 to 2004, considered as one of the key architects of European cooperation on migration. He is now the Director General of IOM since 1st of October of 2018. I would like to invite Mr. Vitorino to share his views and perspectives of migrations, especially after the Global Compact on Refugees signed by 164 nations in Morocco last year. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm always glad when my birth date is mentioned, because it is a unique opportunity for you all to recognize that in spite of my age, I am in very good shape. Having said that, it is a pleasure to be back to ISCTE. That is also a little bit my house, because I was for a number of years curator of the foundation of ISCTE. It's very good to be back to the Portuguese-German Forum. I believe I have attended all the previous sessions, both in Lisbon and in Berlin. And it's good to be present at the first session of this new format, even if probably I have been invited as a testimony of a relic from the past. Having said that, I think that my departing point on migration is to make a reference to a very recent report published by the European University Institute of Florence in cooperation with the Joint Research Center of the European Union, that emphasizes the fact that from 2011 to 2016, trips all over the world have increased by 25%, which means that in 5 years' time, people traveling all around the world have grown up to 2.9 billion trips all over the world, representing 600 million more trips compared to 5 years ago. You might ask, well, what does trips have to do with this? Well, it is a very relevant element, because in fact this shows that contrary to other elements of the globalization, such as a decrease in the rate of growth of trade, for instance, in fact, in terms of mobility, the trend has always been upwards, and a very fast pace of growth. There are two major consequences, or if you want, some reasons and consequences of this global trend. One is definitely the use of modern technologies. Knowing the countries of destination has become much more easy than in the past. And better knowledge, even if sometimes not totally accurate, of the possibilities of countries of destination is definitely a pull factor for people to move. The second reason being that the price of traveling has dropped dramatically, mainly with the introduction of the low-cost airline companies. Of course, there is another side negative event. First one referring to climate change. We can wonder, how can we cope with the targets of reducing CO2 emissions with this kind of growth rate in worldwide travel, in spite of the fact that the airplane manufacturers are trying to do their best, for sure, to reduce the polluting effect of air travel. And the second side impact, of course, is that the data show that the ones who are still the most frequent travelers all over the world are the wealthy people. But a second data that links to the growth of traveling worldwide, and here I'm speaking about air, land, and sea trips, is the fact that 80% of these travels are not cross continents. 80% are intra-regional. Of course, Europe is the highest rate, has the highest rate of intra-European travels, very closely followed by Asia, much lower in the Americas, and even much more lower in Africa. But 80% of these worldwide travels are intra-regional. Now, what has this data to do with migration? Well, I think for two main reasons. The first one is that the trend to human mobility is not slowing down, is increasing. And definitely one of the consequences of this increase is that there will be more pressure for migration. And it is very important to underline that contrary to the ideas that some have, in fact, from 60 to 70% of those who migrate and are considered irregular migrants in the countries of destination, they did not cross the border in an irregular way. Putting it on the reverse side, the majority of those who are considered irregular migrants have crossed borders and they have entered the countries of destination legally, regularly, according to the legislation of those countries of destination. This is extremely important because, don't misunderstand me, of course border controls are extremely important. Of course it is extremely relevant to guarantee that those who cross borders do that on a legal way. Of course it is extremely important that those who want to migrate do it in a regular, orderly and safe way. And that means crossing borders, entering the countries of destination in a legal way. But, in fact, if you take into consideration the backstop of irregular migrants present in the territory of countries of destination, you will come to the conclusion that the vast majority of them did not enter the country irregularly, they just are what we call, in our terrible jargon, overstayers. In the sense that they have stayed in the countries of destination beyond the time limit permitted, whether by the general rules, the 3-month rule of staying in a different country usually, or by staying in the country after the expiry of their visa authorization. And there is a second important element of this data, is that in fact we have the idea, and some politicians use this idea, that we are assisting an invasion. The invasion from south to north. But in fact, the data show that if you take into consideration the African continent, 80%, I'm not wrong, 80% of those who are on the move, those who migrate, do it to another African country. 80% of the African flow of migrants do it inside the African continent. So the picture I want to bring you is that migratory pressures will go on increasing, but the perceptions that we have in a number of countries are not totally in line with the realities. And for decision makers and for academics, you need to deal with the reality, definitely, but you cannot ignore the perceptions. And the perceptions are very far from the reality. The Pew Research poll always makes an inquiry in roughly, if I'm not wrong, 12 countries around the world, of which 6 are European countries, asking how many migrants do you think exist in your country? And usually, the response to this inquiry, the perception of the people that responds is 2 times, 3 times, sometimes 5 times more than the reality. So, you cannot just deal with the reality, you need to deal with the perceptions, because the population of the countries of destination have a very different perception from the reality, and that perception fuels the idea that we are assisting an invasion from south to north. My second point, and definitely in terms of figures, it is absolutely true that in between 2000 and 2018, the total global migrant population in the world has gone from 2.6% in the beginning of the century, of the total population, to 3.4% today, which definitely means that there has been a significant increase of the number of migrants worldwide. From this data, I take one conclusion. The pressure is there. It's going to be there for a very long time. And we need to guarantee that this pressure is dealt with by the authorities in order to make migration a win-win situation, regular, safe and orderly, as the Global Compact says, bearing in mind the challenges that on one side there is pressure, on the other side there is a growing perception that migration is an aggression to countries of destination. And here I touch on the second message. And the second message is, well, probably we think that this is the kind of reaction typical of countries of destination in the global north. Well, not quite. Yes, in Europe, On a number of countries, there is the perception that migration means an aggression, and some populist politicians take advantage of that to pass their political message. But for instance, if you see the Pew Research poll, you will see that the kind of rejection of migration in countries like Canada and the United States, it's much lower than, for instance, in Europe. But even the figures in Europe are lower than the perception of migration and the rejection of migration in some countries of the global south. For instance, in South Africa, in Nigeria, in Kenya, in Mexico, the rates of rejection of new migrants go up to 60%, which is definitely above the rate of rejection of migration in the European continent, which is roughly 56%. Of course, it changes a lot from one country to another, so we are talking about averages. So, second message, it is wrong to think that the only problem that there is in a global vision on migration is a problem of the global north against the global south. On the contrary, we face the same challenges of integrating migrants, of regulating migration, of fighting against populist perceptions and manipulations of migration in the global south as much as in the global north. Third message, we need to be very humble and recognize that the drivers of migratory flows are changing very quickly. Of course, we have also, and still today, the traditional drivers of migration. Unequal distribution of wealth, demographic imbalances, conflicts. If I had to enumerate them, I would say these are the three traditional, quote-unquote, drivers of forced migration. But now we are seeing a growing number of new drivers that have an impact in forcing people to move out of their country. First, I would say natural disasters, which are occurring each time more and more frequently. Are they volcanoes, or hurricanes, or cyclones, or floods? The consequences, more broadly, of climate change, of slow environmental degradation that is forcing people to move, the new phenomenon of internally displaced people, IDPs, which mean people that move inside the same country, but they can no longer live in the country, in the region of origin. They move to a new region. They are, in principle, under the responsibility of the government of that country, but the government of the country cannot cope with the challenges that derive from those movements of people. This is very typical in Africa, for instance, where we will see in the next decade accelerated rate of urbanization. On a number of places, the agricultural production model does not run anymore. Populations cannot live any longer on their regions of origin, and they start on the move. And usually they move to the urban areas. And we see the accelerated growth of a number of African cities. But of course, this kind of move, which is inside the same country, if they don't find livelihoods in the regions where they move to, they will go on moving. And sooner or later, they will be no longer IDPs, internally displaced people. They will cross an international border and they will become international migrants. These new drivers need us to look to the deep root causes of migration, not only in the classical way, preventing conflicts, dealing with poverty, creating jobs, training and professional and vocational training, so people have better possibilities of staying in the countries of origin and being there self-fulfilled, but also need to address these new drivers of migration that put different problems from the past. Having said that, I think that the current situation worldwide is a very paradoxical one. In fact, we see a growing feeling of rejection of migration and new political wings, new political winds that try to build on that mood in the countries of destination in order to stigmatize migration and migrants. But on the other side, we see a strong trend towards increased migration. And I think that we need to take into consideration two major events that have occurred in the past, and to a certain extent that have created the cultural mood for this kind of crashes to occur nowadays. I believe that one of the reasons that is in the basis of this new and cultural environment negative towards migration is definitely the 11th of September 2001 terrorist attacks. That event, I will not elaborate on the details, but I will just call your attention that one of the points that, especially in Europe, but also in the global north, one of the points that is very sensitive and very difficult is that the people asked in the polls make a very strong connection between migration and terrorism. And it is something that we cannot deny, that the kind of connection is easy to be made, and we need to address very seriously. We know that terrorist phenomena occur all over the world. They are always the work of a minority. Left-wing terrorism, extreme left-wing terrorists, or extreme right-wing terrorism, in a number of countries, and we, I think, all have known it, are the work of a minority. But, in fact, when it comes to migration, they are also the work of a minority. But the perception of the public opinion is that it is easy to be demagogically associating migration and terrorism. And this is going to be one of very important issue to address in the years to come. The second one, I believe, is the migration crisis of 2015. It's not as much the question of having 1 million people arriving, mainly to Germany, in a very short period of time. Let's be honest. In the 90s, we had almost 1 million people arriving to Europe in the aftermath of the breakout of the former Yugoslavia. And if you compare the reaction of the public opinion on the 90s and then on 2015, it's quite different. So we need to ask ourselves, why the reaction in 2015? I'm not talking now about the German reaction. The German reaction in the beginning was extremely generous and extremely productive. I'm talking about the lasting effects of that reaction. And we should not be naive. There is a connection between what happened in 2015 and the fact that a number of politicians have taken advantage of migration to pass a very negative message, not just about migration, but about our open societies, about our democracy. So the migration events leverage a broader agenda of populist criticism of our liberal democracies. And I think that what was different in the 2015 crisis compared with the 90s is that, rightly or wrongly, and I must admit probably more rightly than wrongly, the public opinion had the perception that the governments had lost control on their external borders, that the situation was out of control. And definitely we must recognize that there were serious flaws in the external common border of the European Union in 2015. But the side negative impact of this perception is that we are now witnessing of the re-establishment of internal border controls in the Schengen area, well beyond the time limit that will be expected, and we need to take very seriously the issue of guaranteeing the integrity of the external border controls of the European Union. Otherwise, the price will be paid by a very serious setback in the internal freedom of movement of citizens, which is one of the 4 fundamental freedoms of the European Union. And this is the challenge. This is a very key challenge. I'm not talking here about Brexit. I think that anyone today who takes the floor in public should say something about Brexit. I will resist the temptation. To be honest, I'm so confused. But there is one key point. If you see the opinion polls about who voted Brexit, you will see that migration, quote unquote, is considered one of the driving elements of the British to vote to leave the European Union. And the irony, and it is an irony, is that the migration we are talking here is not the same migration that the British talk when they voted for Brexit. The key issue in Britain was the rejection of the free movement of people, which is not an issue of migration in the traditional sense. It's an issue of freedom of movement of people. It's one of the 4 freedoms. That's why the difficulty of the negotiations. The European side has always said the 4 freedoms are indivisible, because they are fundamental, existential freedoms of the European project. But on the other side, the very rejection of the European Union from the British were precisely focusing on one of the 4 freedoms, the freedom of movement of people. Once again, based in perceptions that, to be honest, are wrong. In the last 3 years, before the referendum in Britain, 300,000 foreigners, ambiguous concept, but 300,000 foreigners got into the UK. 300,000. Of which 150,000 did it on the basis of freedom of movement of people, which means half of the foreigners that arrived in the UK in the last 3 years before the referendum were European citizens who moved thanks to the freedom of movement of people. But the other half, the other 150,000 were third country nationals. As you know, Britain not being in Schengen, they keep their absolute control of their external borders. So the decisions taken about the half of the foreigners that arrived in the UK in the 3 years before the referendum was exclusively a decision taken by the British government. There was no impact, no consequences of being in the European Union in what concerns the 150,000 that got in as migrants from third country. But in fact, in the debate on the Brexit, only the first half was at stake. The issue, the debate was always focusing on the 150,000 that were European citizens who moved accordingly to the freedom of movement of people. Arriving here, I would just like, and I do not want to be too long, arriving here, I would say, well, what is, can we anticipate what are going to be the trends in the near future? Well, the first one is the irony that I've mentioned before. In the precise moment where there is this growing sentiment, this growing feeling of rejection of migration, is the moment where the United Nations finally came to the adoption of the Global Compact on Safe, Regular and Orderly Migration. It's the first time where the Sustainable Development Goals, the Agenda 2030, makes an explicit reference between the links, about the links between migration and development. So we can say that they move in contradictory directions. The international community at UN level, for the first time, incorporates a political framework of cooperation, the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration, which is definitely a step forward in terms of international cooperation, but on the other side, a number of key countries experience a strong rejection of migration. So strong that some of countries did not even subscribe to the Global Compact on Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. Well, everybody's thinking about one country, isn't it? Yeah, that's one of them. But we need to be also humble and recognize that the Global Compact was not subscribed by 8 European Union countries, which will have a major impact in the way the European Union, and above all the next European institutions, will act in the field of migration, not just only internally, but also in the very key relation between migration and foreign policy. Because don't forget that, according to the treaties, foreign policy is still a policy area submitted to the rule of unanimity. So this irony will persist for a number of years now in front of us. A lot depends on the relations of forces from the European Parliament elections, definitely. And a lot depends also on how countries who have a reasonable, middle of the road, honest approach to migration will behave in the years to come. And that's why I accepted to come here. Because I do believe that Portugal and Germany are two of those countries. And we have already proved that, I think. And we desperately need reasonable, rational, balanced voices in this public debate about migration. A debate that does not skip the difficulties. There are difficulties, challenges, extremely demanding challenges. Integration is one of the challenges. And I think that, for instance, I would say that Portugal is a very good example. And the work that has been done in Germany for integrating the refugees after 2015 is a remarkable work. Not sufficiently known worldwide. So I think that on this point the Germans should be much more vocal, explaining the challenges, the obstacles, the difficulties, but also the success that has been achieved. And we desperately need success stories. And at the same time, we need also the politicians from the mainstream not to be shy. Not to be shy. Yes, there are values here at stake. Yes, there are principles. And it is worth fighting for values and for principles. It is an illusion to think that going just behind what appears to be the mainstream is the way of getting popular support. I've always learned that in these cases, people prefer the original, not the copies. So it's a cultural debate. Yes, it is. It is a debate that should not skip the difficulties, the obstacles, the challenges, the threats that migration can represent. Yes, it is. But at the same time, it's a debate where those who believe that migration can have a positive impact, both in countries of destination and in countries of origin, that migration is closely linked with development, that migration is closely linked with peace, security, and community stabilization in the countries of origin, they have to make their voices heard. Because in fact, if you look to the world as we live in today, we are confronted with a huge number, I've counted at least 8, major humanitarian crises all over the world. They go from Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, with the Rohingya, 1,100,000. I've just came from Cox's Bazar last week. There are 1,100,000 Rohingya who live in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh after what happened to them in Myanmar. To Yemen, which is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world today. 24 million in risk of famine, 4 million people internally displaced, and at the moment we speak, 5,000 migrants detained in a stadium in infrahuman conditions. Syria, which is a source of enormous concern due to the difficulties of the international community to access the territory of Syria to support the people who are suffering in Syria, and above all, the 4 million internally displaced people that exist in Syria. Libya, where the fight has been extremely difficult in these last few weeks, where there is a dispute of the control of the capital, Tripoli, and even 6,000 migrants are in detention centers in infrahuman conditions again, and they have already been in the fire line, and unfortunately there are some casualties. The Sahel region, where definitely there is an increase of the activity of the terrorist groups operating in the area that put into question the stability of those countries and are seriously affecting the stabilization of the communities. Central America, which will tend to look only to the caravans, the phenomenon of the caravans. But in fact, if you read the New York Times today, you will see that due to security problems, to the activity of criminal gangs, in these last few years, there have been more people murdered in Central and Latin America than in the Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya wars altogether. So if you look to Latin America and Central America, the problem is not just a question of traditional root causes of migration, poverty, lack of jobs, but equally important is security, community stabilization, peace, law and order. Now we have, more recently, the natural crisis in Mozambique, the two cyclones, which have affected roughly 2 million people. Or, if you want to look at more closely, the very serious situation that exists in the Democratic Republic of Congo, with the outbreak of a new Ebola crisis that is extremely challenging in a region where the mobility of people inside the region is very high, and the capacity to access is very much limited due to the action of terrorist groups. And last but not least, because that's in the newspapers every day, the situation in Venezuela. The situation in Venezuela is a twofold humanitarian crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis inside Venezuela, as we are seeing, but it's also a very serious situation for the 3.5 million Venezuelans who in these last 5 years have left the country, and they are in the countries of the neighborhood, mainly 1.1 million in Colombia, 700,000 in Peru, 350,000 in Ecuador, 130,000 in Argentina, or 90,000 in the state of Roraima in Brazil. We are talking about very serious humanitarian crisis that last year the United Nations collected 100 billion euros, 100 billion euros to support the people who are suffering enormously in these different humanitarian crises. So the challenges are in front of us. We need a reasonable, middle of the road, pragmatic approach to these challenges. And the only thing I am sure about is that definitely I will not be bored in the next few years of my life. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Mr. Victorino for your excellent intervention. That it will guide us during our day of work. Mr. Victorino is available to 2 or 3 questions, not more, because he has a flight to catch. But I'm glad we will break the ice.
I know I am
nobody?
so depressed.
Aquela senhora lá em cima estava primeiro, sim. If you can say your name, please.
Hello, my name is Filipa Abcacis. I'm from Caritas, Portugal. Thank you very much to Mr. Antonio Vitorino. It was very interesting to hear his ideas and his very wide experience on migration. We are working here in Portugal and across Europe with Caritas Europa around the migration issues as well. And we are working very hard on the Global Compact on Migration. I heard you were telling about the 8 countries that did not sign the Global Compact in Europe. And I would like to know a little bit more, because we are working together with 11 countries, and many of them are among these 8 that did not sign the Global Compact, so it would be very difficult and challenging to work around migration with them, and especially with the European elections coming soon. How do you feel that Europe will advance in the Global Compact? Is it a document that will die over time, or should we continue forcing and doing some advocacy for its implementation? Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Vitorino, for your speech. I found it very interesting. I subscribe a lot of the things you have highlighted. On the other hand, I wanted to ask you one thing. You stressed the importance to regulate migration, to create forms of ordered and well organized, well managed migration. I wonder how we can combine these forms. On the other hand, you also mentioned some of the byproducts of some of the forms of regulating migration, for example, camps in Libya. And so I just wonder, what do you think about the difficulties in combining order migration and the active initiatives to create conditions of order and regular migration with human rights?
Last one. Just 2? Okay.
Thank you, Thomas Stelzer, Austria. Thank you very much for your expose. My question is, there is obviously a very clear hegemony in the discussion on migration of the xenophobic forces. How do you support the positive discussion on migration, the macroeconomic issues, the benefits of migration to the countries of origin, to the countries of arrival? How do you promote the externalities in this equation? So how do you tilt the discussion away from a negative xenophobic point to a more positive, future-oriented, demographically oriented, macroeconomically based discussion?
So thank you so much for the questions. On the first question of the Global Compact, it gives me the opportunity to say that one of the reasonable voices that exist about migration is one of Pope Francis. I forgot that. Since you come from Caritas, it is a very good opportunity to underline this key point. I don't think that a decision that has been taken by 152 countries worldwide in the General Assembly of the United Nations will fade away. Of course, the resistance and the rejection of the Global Compact has been higher and bigger than I expected, to be honest. I confess. And I believe that on a number of cases, that rejection is mainly due to internal political reasons. So I'm not pessimistic in that sense, because I think that no single country in the world, not even the most powerful one, you can guess, not even the most powerful one, can deal with the challenges of migration alone. International cooperation will be fundamental to deal with the Global Compact. So, in that sense, I believe that it's up to the member states now that have subscribed to the Global Compact to implement it. The Global Compact is very clear. It is a state-led process. So governments should be in the driving seat of implementing the Global Compact. And they will implement the Global Compact in different perspectives, because the Global Compact has a 360-degree vision. There are things in the Global Compact that are more adequate to countries of destination and things that are more adequate for countries of origin. On our side, not only as an organization, but also as the coordinator of the UN Migration Network that has been created by the Secretary General of the United Nations last year, we will do our best to support our member states to implement the Global Compact according to their priorities, according to their preferences, according to their needs. And I believe that international cooperation will remain a key issue, and that these times that we are living through of suspicion about multilateralism, about international cooperation, will be overcome. As the French say, chasser le naturel, il revient au galop. I believe that on a number of cases the reality will prevail. International cooperation is fundamental. And it is also fair to say, especially in Europe, that even those countries who are more reluctant in relation to the Global Compact do not deny the need for cooperation with the countries of origin if we want to succeed in dealing with migratory flows. So it's a little bit a prioristic to say that those who are not in the Global Compact are against international cooperation. No, not at all. Not at all. So we need to be very pragmatic in that respect and take the best of the opportunities to engage with the countries that did not subscribe to the Global Compact. Which leads me to the second question. There is no possibility of having a safe, order and regular migratory flows if there is not a close cooperation between countries of destination, countries of transit and countries of origin along the migratory journey. This means also that the countries of origin tackle irregular migration, fight against trafficking human beings, punish the smugglers. But at the same time, we need to say that the countries of destination need to have regular pathways for migration. And I think, to be honest, that the two countries that are here today are a very good example. The Portuguese legislation of regular migration is a very flexible one. At the current moment, at the moment we speak, in Germany, the Germans are adopting a new legislation on middle skill and high skill migration, legal migration, which is a very promising legislation, which probably will be a very good example, together with the Portuguese example, to show that the best way of having regular, safe and orderly migration is to have a very strong stance against illegal migration, against irregular migration, against trafficking human beings, against smugglers, because those are the perpetrators of the most serious violation of human rights of the migrants, but at the same time that there are regular pathways towards regular legal migration. The question that you've raised about Libya is a very important one. The conditions on which migrants are detained in Libya are totally unacceptable. The detention centers in Libya are violating the human rights, and they just need to be closed. That's it. Having said that, what we have been doing in these last few years, 3 years, is taking out of Libya more than 60,000 migrants that were stranded there, bringing them back to the countries of origin and reintegrating them there. This is very important. And for instance, Germany is a key partner in this project. We must be aware of the fact that the migrants that are stranded, not just because they are in an irregular situation, but because they are caught in the middle of a war, that was the case in Libya, when they are taken out of Libya, as we do, even now, where the situation is terrible, where there is fighting around the airport, we go on doing our flights of taking migrants out of Libya. We send them to the countries of origin, but then we need to reintegrate them in the countries of origin. Return is one side of the coin, the other side of the coin is reintegration. And reintegration is quite a challenge for the countries of origin. Because it's not just finding a purpose of the people who are returned to live back in the country of origin. It's much more complex than that. It requires the stabilization of the communities of origin. If they don't find security in the communities of origin, they will not be reintegrated. It's also a question of leveraging the development of those communities of origin that must benefit not only the returnees, but also the population, the host population. And we have a few examples of success where we have been able to create a safe environment for returnees to reintegrate, benefiting also the host community. But of course, I cannot say that there is a magic solution. You know that every month, there are 7,500 people who cross the Gulf of Aden. They go to Yemen with the objective of going to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries. So you can imagine what is in the mind of a person that crosses the Gulf of Aden, goes to Yemen, a country at war, so desperate to get to a country of destination. 7,500, and those are the ones we register, okay? Probably the real figure is higher than what I am mentioning. So what happens? Well, what happens is that for the last 4 months, even in the middle of the Yemen war, we have been, IOM has been engaged in taking Ethiopian migrants out of Yemen, where they are stranded, caught by the war, and bringing them back mainly to Addis Ababa and then to the regions of origin. So the issue is not just cooperation between countries of origin and countries of destination. It's also to bear in mind that it is absolutely necessary to stabilize the countries, so the peace and security agenda of the Secretary General is also a key element of migration policy and fundamental for migration policy. Last but not least, Ambassador, you raise a very critical question. I think that it would be wrong to assume that those who have a negative position on migration are xenophobic. No, they are not. There are lots of reasons for people to be suspicious or reluctant in relation to migration. For instance, the stocking of middle class income, doubts about the future of the sustainability of the social security system, the anguish of the future of work, what kind of labor market we'll have in the next few years. All those elements create a sense that our social model is under attack. And migrants are the scapegoat, the easy scapegoat. But that said, that does not mean that all of those who have a negative perception of migration do it on a racist and xenophobic basis. No. But of course there are some who do it on a racist and xenophobic basis. Definitely. I'm going to say something that might surprise you. I'm less concerned with that minority of racist and xenophobic approach. I'm much more concerned in reaching out the ones who have a negative perception on migration, but do not do that on the basis of racist and xenophobic proposals. Those are the ones we can win. Those are the ones we cannot leave alone in the hands of the racists and xenophobics, okay? Those are the ones who we need to be persuaded that yes, it is possible to have safe, regular and orderly migration without putting into question your job, your pension, your environment, the environment where we live, your small village or your quarter in a town. Having said that, of course, the racist and xenophobic approach has some leverage today. I must recognize that. Even some sensible economic arguments do not make the case anymore. Because we are entering an era of identitarian politics. And that's very dangerous. Because identitarian politics is a way of creating apartheids, of creating bubbles in the society. It's an instrument of loosening social cohesion and social solidarity. And that undermines the very basis of a nation state, by the way. So the nationalists play a very dangerous game, using identitarian politics, but at the same time, identitarian politics is a way of creating apartheid groups inside a society and loosening the cohesiveness of the national society. But that's a broader problem that goes far beyond migration. The best way of addressing this issue is, I've said already, the pragmatic and rational approach. We should not paint migration with a pink color. Well, pink maybe it's not the best example here in Portugal. Okay, with light colors. Skipping the difficulties, skipping the challenges, hiding them, or having the best thing to say is to have a pure economic argument. Migration is good because they contribute more to our social security system than they receive. That's true. That's absolutely true. That will not do the case. Because we are far beyond now the pure economic arguments. Now we are deepening in identitarian arguments. And we need to make the case for the advantages of a diversified society. For the possibility of living together with different stances, ethnic, religious, origin. Of course, countries like Portugal have a certain track record in that. Other countries do not have that track record. So the way of dealing with these challenges, identitarian challenges, is different from country to country. But each country needs to find its own way. The values are the same. The challenges are different. There is no solution one fits all. But there is a need to mobilize those who believe in open societies, that believe in the possibility of living together, respecting each one's differences, but having a bulk of common values that are respected by all, irrespective of their territory of origin, their religion, the color of the skin, whatever. Well, that's why it is very important to debate these issues, and I wish you all in this forum a very fruitful debate. Thank you so much for having listened to me.
I would like to thank you once again very warmly, your presence and your an excellent intervention. I think one of the key, probably the key message that Mr. Vitorino conveyed to us, and it's very important to our debate during the day, is that we have to deal and focus on reality, but we cannot ignore perceptions. Thank you very much once again. We'll immediately start the first panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.